The original Doom on Game Boy Advance is perfectly fine. Squeezing Doom down to play on Nintendo's bite-sized handheld was a monumental feat in 2001. Doom in the pockets of gamers worldwide was a frontier the series hadn't quite cracked yet. It was a big deal to not only arrive, but arrive in a way that was fun and playable. But here's the thing, it could potentially have been a lot better. And to explain this, I'm going to have to talk about John Carmack and Activision. See, it's common knowledge within the Doom community that John Carmack was really a stickler when it came to the specifics of programming. Given how much blood, sweat and tears he'd poured into the Doom franchise, he had a right to be overly protective. However, there have been times in the past when John Carmack may have overstepped even that line, and it led to some awkwardness and inferior products being delivered to customers. Most Doom fans are aware of how poor the Sega Saturn port of Doom is. A big part of the reason for that is John Carmack getting involved in the development of the port and effectively tying the hands of the programmers at Rage Software, who were not allowed to use their own engine or use the Saturn's VDP-1 processor to draw and handle the game like they wanted to. This is because texture warping could have been a side effect, and John Carmack apparently hated that so much in the 1990s that he made the team go back to the drawing board and reheat the PlayStation 1 version of Doom instead. The end result? A mess. But that's not why I'm talking to you right now. You see, Carmack had a hand in a lot of the Doom console ports. He built the Jaguar version and oversaw a lot of the ports for the original Doom game. So if there was one person who knew what was best for the console versions of Doom, you'd think it would be John Carmack. But there's one port where his and Activision's interference potentially derailed what would have been a much better Doom experience. That experience would have been on the Game Boy Advance with the original Doom game. Doom 1 on the GBA was developed by David A. Palmer Productions. The studio had experience importing games to Nintendo platforms in the past. Series like Need for Speed, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars outings were developed by the studio over the years. Doom was well within their ability, and the studio impressed enough that they got the gig for Doom 1 on the Game Boy Advance, with a hope that Doom 2 could follow if they stuck the landing. Development began in 2000 and the team got to work on their port of Doom 1. They spent 9 months putting together a version of Doom running on a custom engine. The idea was to cater to the unique Game Boy Advance hardware and get as much power from the console as it could. Remember, Game Boy Advance was not designed for games like Doom. Speaking about the development of the game during those initial months, David A. Palmer stated in the Minds Behind the Games book, "We had a fantastic team working on Doom GBA and it was due to their experience and skill that it came out as it did. I'd flown out to Mesquite with one of our programmers, Byron Nielsen, and collected that CD. I probably have it somewhere with some of my notes of the development, but I know it was a bit of a nightmare at first. But if I remember rightly, once we had the segregation between the code and WAD sorted and understood how the original code worked, it was easier. The team were confident they were heading in the right direction, and the resulting product would be a smash hit. Then the entire development cycle got turned on its head, with Palmer stating, "We had developed most of Doom creating our own 3D code. Matt Hopwood was the lead programmer, a superb 3D math programmer. We had a few sticking points to work around to get 30 frames per second, but we were very close to sorting it, and 9 months into the project, when John Carmack found the Jaguar source code on a CD in his garage loft or some such obscure location. The end result of this was that Carmack and Activision wanted the team to scrap all the work they'd done and instead adapt Jaguar Doom source code for the handheld console. They wanted us to use that code instead of our code, so we did. If our version had been 100% polished by Matt, I do believe it would have been the better game, as the code was purposely written for the Game Boy Advance, but that is in the past and I was happy with what was published." It's not really clear why the call to make this 11th hour change came, and it's not clear in any interviews who spearheaded that change. With months to go until the projected release date, it seems like a very weird choice to make. The team seemed confident, and it seems, from all accounts offered, that the decision to 180 the project came from nowhere. It's also telling that John Carmack had to personally go and retrieve the Jaguar code from his garage himself, indicating that he was very determined to make this happen. Palmer commented on this when he said, "Swapping back to the Jaguar code held us up badly, and it was tight time-wise. The team worked away to get the new Jaguar-inspired Doom running as smooth as possible. I flew out to E3 that year with a CD of the finished Doom Game Boy Advance game code, and a few ready-blown cartridges. It went down an absolute storm at E3, and id Software and Activision guys had big smiles on their faces. So with all that out of the way, you'd imagine that the studio would be front of the queue for the upcoming Doom 2 port on Game Boy Advance. When Doom landed on GBA, it didn't sell super well. That didn't seem to impress Activision or id Software, who gave the rights to Doom 2 to Australia's Taurus Games." Palmer commented on this when he stated, "We had sorted all the coding issues, so whoever got the rights to Doom 2 had a cakewalk to develop the game. I honestly think they used a lot of our code in certain areas, or it allowed them to do what we wanted to do with Doom 2 if we had gotten the development. We should have agreed to a multi-game deal in order to better amortize our investments in GBA Doom, which we spent a lot of time on. My fault. And GBA Doom didn't sell that well, 140,000 copies, despite some great reviews. I have my own thoughts on that. The game was released October 2001. At the time, Xbox was released November 2001, a busy time. Magazines, news outlets and stores were all focused on the upcoming Xbox. It should be noted that the suggestions made by Palmer in this interview have never been substantiated, but the whole thing, from an outsider's perspective, does appear quite odd. This is why I'm going to engage in some wild speculation, and I need to say before expressing thoughts that John Carmack has never really spoken about the Game Boy Advance port in interviews. There is no evidence that he was the one who made the call to change the direction of development. I looked far and wide, and yet he's never really given a reason why his Jaguar code had to be hastily drafted into the port. However, when you observe Carmack's behaviour around the Sega Saturn port and what happened when Rage Software tried to implement their own engine, it isn't hard to draw a line between the common denominators here. I also can't really imagine that Activision would have cared one way or the other. To them, the game was getting released either way, so I can't really imagine they were super keen to throw development in the air when they could have ruined the product overall. It also doesn't really make sense when you look at Doom 2 on Game Boy Advance and realise that that version runs on its own custom engine, the Southpaw engine. The sheer number of issues that brought into the Doom 2 experience are worthy of their own discussion. So it's all very weird that the reported build of GBA Doom 1 caused someone to want to upend the entire process, but the issues on Doom 2 seemingly didn't. At the end of the day, this is only one side of the discussion. As I said, John Carmack has never really spoken about this, and obviously Activision moved on very quickly. GBA Doom was probably not even a blip on their radar. It's also a shame we never really got to see what could have been, and if the team at Palmer were onto something better, or if it was just hearsay and hype from them. There's also the potential that Carmack and the team at id Software didn't like what they saw from the prototype builds, and just made the decision that it wasn't the version that they wanted to put on Game Boy Advance. Maybe it was something about the art direction, maybe it was the implementation of that engine, or maybe they just lacked the confidence that Palmer and his team could actually see through their technical promises. I also do need to state that I'm not suggesting any malice went on during these proceedings, I just find them a bit odd and interesting to discuss. It is telling that Palmer and his team weren't invited back to continue their work with Doom 2. The real shame at the end of all this is that fans of Doom were robbed of a port that potentially had way more to offer than the retail version we got. I've never really had an issue with the original version of Doom on Game Boy Advance, but I will also say that it's always struck me as a fairly basic offering. In particular when you see Doom 2 running in almost full glory on the Game Boy Advance, it's really hard not to feel that there was a lot of potential left on the table with this one. The silver lining though is that Palmer and his team don't seem overly bothered by this when they've been recounting the tale. If you're curious, at the time of this video's making, none of the prototypes I've discussed in this video for Doom 1 or Doom 2 on Game Boy Advance have ever been released into the wild, but if they were, I'd be very interested in giving them a try. If you want a good showcase for what this potential might have been in these new versions, GBA Doom source port, which was created by fans, does a good job of showcasing this. Fans of Doom took it upon themselves to fill in the blanks and released a version of Doom based off the PR Boom source port. This port is more ambitious, features all of the original Ultimate Doom levels, and even allows for Doom 2 and Final Doom to be played. But overall, it's interesting to me that the first true portable version of Doom had its own controversy and interesting development cycle. I'd love to know your thoughts on all this, and I'd also like to know if you'd play those prototypes if they were ever released into the wild.